June 4, 1942. The sun climbs slowly over the endless blue of the Pacific. Aboard the USS Enterprise, the steel deck trembles as engines roar to life. The air tastes of salt, oil, and anticipation. Young pilots, faces streaked with sweat and determination, pull on their flight goggles. Beneath their boots, the ship cuts through the sea toward destiny. The aircraft lined along the deck don't look impressive. Their riveted skins bear scratches, paint scorched from months of service. They're slower than their Japanese counterparts, less sleek, less feared. Many in Washington once called them obsolete. But today, these outdated dive bombers, Douglas SBD Dauntless, carry the weight of a nation. Each holds a single 1,000-pound bomb. Its purpose simple: find the enemy and destroy their carriers before America's are found. As the launch officer's flag drops, the first Dauntless roars forward, wheels lift, and the pilot glances at the horizon. Ahead lies the Japanese fleet, and history waiting to be rewritten. The machine once rejected is about to decide the fate of the Pacific. In the years before war erupted across the Pacific, the U.S. Navy stood at a crossroads. Battleships still ruled the imagination of admirals and congressmen alike. Massive floating fortresses that symbolized national power. Aircraft carriers, by contrast, were seen as fragile, experimental platforms. Many within the fleet believed aviation would always serve as a scout, never the spearhead of attack. Yet, far from the marble offices in Washington, a quiet revolution was underway. Engineers and test pilots were redefining what an airplane could do at sea. Among them was a young and determined designer named Ed Heinemann, working for the Douglas Aircraft Company in California. His vision was bold: a dive bomber that could withstand the crushing forces of a near-vertical plunge and still deliver its payload with surgical precision. The idea of dive bombing itself was controversial. Critics argued it was reckless. Pilots plunging thousands of feet at impossible angles, trusting their wings and courage to survive the dive. But Heinemann and his test pilot, Vance Breeze, believed in precision over volume. One well-placed bomb, they argued, could do more damage than a dozen dropped blindly. By 1938, their creation, the Douglas SBD, short for Scout Bomber Douglas, was ready. It wasn't fast, nor sleek. Its top speed barely touched 255 miles per hour. Yet its structure was nearly indestructible. Large perforated dive brakes along its wings allowed pilots to control terrifying descents without ripping their planes apart. And most importantly, it could deliver a single bomb straight into the heart of a target from thousands of feet above. When presented to Navy officials, however, the response was lukewarm at best. Many dismissed it as too heavy and too slow. Some even labeled it obsolete before it ever flew from a carrier deck. The Navy wanted speed, aircraft that could chase down enemy bombers or outrun fighters. The SBD, they said, was a relic in an age of innovation. But among the pilots, whispers spread of something different. Test flights showed that the aircraft could take damage and keep flying, its armor and control responsiveness unlike anything else. The cockpit offered clear visibility in steep dives. Its reliability at sea impressed carrier crews who knew that salt, heat, and wind could cripple most aircraft within days. As 1940 arrived, the world was changing fast. Europe was already burning. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies over Poland and France. And in Asia, the Empire of Japan expanded rapidly, seizing territory and threatening American interests in the Pacific. In the quiet shipyards of California, production of the Dauntless continued, slowly, almost reluctantly funded. The Navy, hedging its bets, ordered a small number, assigning them to carriers like the Lexington, Yorktown, and Enterprise. Few imagined they would play a decisive role in any future war. Then came December 7, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor shattered America's illusions of safety. Battleships burned in the harbor, smoke rising into the Hawaiian sky. The old pillars of naval supremacy lay crippled in the mud. For the first time, it was the aircraft carrier, not the battleship, that would become America's sword. And on those decks, waiting quietly, were the aircraft once deemed unnecessary, the SBD Dauntless. In the months that followed, These planes would launch from the Pacific's few surviving carriers to strike back. They hit Japanese bases in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, showing both courage and precision. Their losses were light. Their hits were real. Still, many in Japan considered them a nuisance, not a threat. Their Zero fighters easily outmatched the Dauntless in speed and maneuverability. But American pilots were learning. They studied dive patterns, refined attack angles, and improved coordination between squadrons. The Dauntless was proving itself not by being the fastest but by being the most reliable. And as U.S. intelligence began piecing together Japanese radio intercepts, whispers of a massive operation began to surface. A plan to lure what remained of America's carriers into a trap near a tiny atoll called Midway. For the men of the U.S. Navy, this would be their reckoning. For the Dauntless, it would be its destiny. By the spring of 1942, the war in the Pacific had turned grim. Japan's expansion seemed unstoppable. In 6 months, they had taken Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Philippines. Their navy, the most powerful in the Pacific, stretched from Southeast Asia to the Central Ocean. The American fleet, bloodied and vastly outnumbered, retreated to regroup. Yet, beneath the shock and loss, a quiet transformation was underway. The Navy's carrier groups, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, became moving fortresses, striking in fast, surgical raids. The age of the battleship was over. The age of the carrier had begun. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was there at every early step. Over the Marshall Islands in February 1942, Dauntless pilots struck Japanese shipping and bases, flying through walls of anti-aircraft fire. They returned to their carriers battered, riddled with holes, but intact. Mechanics would patch the metal, refill the fuel, and the same aircraft would fly again the next morning. At first, the Japanese dismissed these attacks. Their reports called the American dive bombers slow and clumsy. But intelligence officers began noticing something else. Every strike left serious damage. American pilots weren't wasting bombs. They were finding critical targets: supply ships, fuel depots, communications towers. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, began planning his next great strike. His goal: lure the remaining U.S. carriers into a trap, destroy them completely, and force America to negotiate peace. His chosen battlefield was a tiny, isolated speck of coral halfway between Hawaii and Japan, Midway Atoll. For Yamamoto, Midway was more than a target. It was a statement, a trap that would end American resistance in the Pacific. He planned to attack in early June 1942, believing the U.S. Navy would rush to defend it. What he didn't know was that American cryptographers had broken parts of Japan's JN-25 naval code. Inside a small, windowless building at Pearl Harbor, U.S. intelligence officers worked around the clock, piecing together fragments of intercepted messages. Commander Joseph Rockefort and his team confirmed the objective, AF, was Midway. Their warning reached Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz acted fast. He ordered 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, to ambush the Japanese fleet before they could strike. While Nimitz moved his pieces, the men who would carry out the attack trained relentlessly. Pilots practiced near-vertical dives, releasing bombs at terrifying altitudes. They drilled until muscle memory replaced fear. The Dauntless, once seen as outdated, was now central to their mission. On carrier decks scattered across the Pacific, young men studied maps and photographs of Japanese carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. They memorized ship silhouettes, learning where to aim, the flight deck elevators, the hangar bays, the fuel lines. The accuracy of one dive could decide the battle. The Dauntless design, simple yet brilliant, began to reveal its worth. Its large, perforated dive brakes allowed pilots to descend at 70-degree angles without losing control. Its rugged frame could survive the stress of near-vertical dives. And its 2-man crew, pilot and rear gunner, formed an unbreakable bond, trusting each other's instincts as they faced enemy fire. Meanwhile, in Japan, confidence remained high. The Imperial Navy had more carriers, more aircraft, and more experience. Their pilots, veterans of China and Pearl Harbor, believed the Americans were still reeling. To them, the coming battle was a formality. But deep below deck aboard the Enterprise, pilots and crew of Scouting Squadron 6, VS-6, and Bombing Squadron 6, VB-6, prepared in silence. They knew the odds, yet their faith in the Dauntless had grown. Could take hits, keep flying, and bring them home. In a war of attrition that mattered more than speed. On May 28, 1942, the U.S. carriers left Pearl Harbor. Their decks crowded with aircraft, Wildcats, Devastators, and rows of SBD Dauntless gleaming under the morning sun. Sailors waved goodbye, unsure if they'd ever see home again. For days later, near the tiny speck of Midway Atoll, radar blips would appear on screens. The Japanese fleet had arrived, and somewhere above the clouds, hundreds of Dauntless pilots tightened their harnesses, checked their bomb cradles, and whispered quiet prayers. They were about to fly into the defining moment of the Pacific War, the human angle. For every gleaming aircraft on the carrier deck, there was a man inside it, usually in his early 20s, barely out of flight school. Many had never seen combat before, yet these young pilots carried the burden of an entire ocean war on their shoulders. The cockpit of a Dauntless was not a comfortable place. The steel frame vibrated like a living creature, and when the pilot pushed the nose downward into a dive, gravity crushed his body with forces reaching 6 gs. Blood drained from his head, vision narrowed, and every muscle strained against the pull of the dive. The pilot's gloved hand tightened on the control stick, his thumb resting on the bomb release switch. Behind him, the rear gunner, often a friend, sometimes a brother in arms, watched the skies for Zero fighters. Theirs was a partnership born of necessity and survival. Communication was shouted over roaring engines and the shriek of air passing over metal. In those moments, the line between life and death was razor thin. Pilots spoke later of how the Dauntless felt different. Stable, solid, trustworthy. It wasn't fast, but it responded faithfully even when riddled with holes. They learned to trust its weight, its wings, its ability to pull out of dives that would have torn other planes apart. To dive bomb successfully required something more than skill. It demanded nerve. At 15,000 feet, the pilot would spot the glint of a Japanese carrier far below. He would roll the plane onto its back, flip into a near-vertical dive, and the world would spin. The horizon vanished, the sea rushed upward, and the ship below grew larger by the second. The pilot's heart pounded in rhythm with the airframe's tremors. Tracers and anti-aircraft shells streaked past, bright red lines against blue sky. At 2,000 feet, with seconds to spare, he pressed the release. The bomb fell, slicing through the air. The pilot pulled hard, the Dauntless shuddering violently, diving brakes screaming, wings straining not to fold. Every successful strike was a miracle of courage and timing. And in those early months of 1942, that courage kept the Pacific from collapsing entirely. The technological angle. The Dauntless was a product of thoughtful engineering, a machine designed not for beauty, but for endurance. Every feature served a purpose born from trial and error. Its signature innovation, the perforated dive brakes, was revolutionary. Other aircraft, when diving steeply, would accelerate uncontrollably, making bomb release nearly impossible. The Dauntless brakes, metal flaps studded with circular holes, created drag without instability. They allowed a pilot to maintain control even at a 70-degree descent, a terrifying angle for any aircraft of its time. The structure of the Dauntless was overbuilt by design. Its riveted fuselage could absorb punishment that would destroy lighter planes. Its undercarriage was reinforced for the brutal impacts of carrier landings. Mechanics affectionately called it the aircraft that refused to die. The bomb cradle beneath its fuselage swung downward before release, ensuring the weapon cleared the propeller arc during steep dives. It was a simple mechanism, yet it allowed pinpoint strikes on small, moving targets, ships, supply depots, even tanks. The Dauntless was powered by a single Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engine, producing about 1,200 horsepower. It wasn't the most powerful engine in the sky, but it was reliable. The aircraft could climb steadily, take damage, and keep flying on partial power. Many pilots returned home with bullet holes stitched across the fuselage and oil leaking from the cowling. Yet the engine never failed them. Its armament reflected its dual role as scout and attacker. 2.50 caliber machine guns in the nose and twin .30 calibers mounted at the rear provided protection during retreat. The aircraft carried a single 1,000-pound bomb or a pair of 500-pounders under its wings. It was enough to cripple a destroyer or pierce the decks of a carrier. Perhaps its greatest strength, however, was not any single feature, but its balance. It was not the fastest, the heaviest, or the most agile, but it combined all elements in perfect harmony. It was predictable, and in combat, predictability was life. Japanese engineers later studied captured Dauntless aircraft and marveled at their resilience. To them, the design seemed crude, even primitive, yet it worked flawlessly in the harshest environments. The Americans had built a weapon that matched their strategy. Durable, efficient, and unrelenting. As the carriers steamed toward Midway, these machines stood ready on deck, wings folded like resting birds. The pilots trusted them, the crews revered them, and soon the enemy would learn to fear them. The human courage and mechanical precision of the Dauntless would meet their ultimate test, against the might of Japan's first air fleet. The morning of June 4th began deceptively calm. Clouds rolled lazily across the sky, and the sea shimmered like polished glass. But beneath that surface calm, both fleets were moving toward a collision that would change the war forever. By dawn, Japanese Admiral Chuchi Nagumo's massive armada, 4 carriers, bristling with aircraft and escorted by cruisers and destroyers, advanced toward Midway Atoll. They had already launched a devastating first wave of bombers, leaving the island scarred and smoking. Confident of their dominance, Nagumo prepared to send another strike. He believed American carriers were still days away. He was wrong. Far to the northeast, American codebreakers had already deciphered Japan's attack plans. Admiral Chester Nimitz, calm and methodical, had set an ambush. 3 U.S. carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged Yorktown, waited silently, hidden beyond the horizon. Their decks buzzed with tension. Pilots checked fuel lines, ammunition, and the single 1,000-pound bomb that might alter history. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, commanding a squadron of Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, studied his map. "If we don't find them soon," he muttered, "we'll never make it back." The fuel gauges dipped lower as the planes droned across endless blue. No sign of the enemy, just ocean. Hours passed. The search seemed hopeless. Then a glint on the sea. A lone Japanese destroyer cutting fast through the waves. McCluskey made a choice that would define the battle. Trusting instinct over orders, he followed the destroyer's wake, straight toward the heart of the Japanese fleet. Below, the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were in chaos. Their decks were crammed with aircraft being refueled and rearmed for a second strike. Torpedoes and bombs lay exposed under the rising heat of the morning sun. Then came a sound, faint at first, then growing louder, the unmistakable whine of diving engines. McCluskey's Dauntless appeared high above, sunlight glinting off their wings. The dive began. Each pilot flipped his plane upside down, pointed the nose almost vertically, and plunged through the clouds. The wind screamed. The altimeter spun wildly. Anti-aircraft fire burst all around, black puffs of death. At 20,000 feet, 10,000, 5000, the pilots held steady, waiting until the target filled their vision. Now! Bomb bay doors snapped open. 1,000 pounds of steel and fury hurtled downward. In less than 5 minutes, everything changed. The first bomb smashed through the deck of Kaga, detonating amid rows of armed planes. A white-hot fireball engulfed the carrier, blasting men and aircraft into the sea. Moments later, Akagi and Soryu erupted too, infernos roaring skyward, their decks melting, their crews leaping into the ocean. 3 of Japan's prized carriers, gone in minutes. The dauntless pilots pulled out of their dives, their bodies crushed by G-forces, eyes blurred with sweat and smoke. Behind them, the horizon burned. But victory wasn't complete. One carrier, Hiryu, remained. Furious, Its commander launched a counterattack, striking the Yorktown with precision bombs that left her dead in the water. Yet the Americans refused to yield. Later that afternoon, another wave of Dauntless found Hiryu and sent her to the depths as well. By sunset, the Pacific was littered with wreckage and oil fires. The Japanese Navy, once invincible, had lost 4 carriers and hundreds of its most experienced pilots. The tide of war had turned. For the men who survived the battle, the victory was both triumph and tragedy. Many never made it back to their carriers. They ditched into the sea, their radios silent. Those who did return carried the weight of what they'd seen. The chaos, the courage, the friends lost mid-dive. On the Enterprise, sailors gathered silently on deck, watching columns of smoke rise from the horizon. No one cheered. They simply stared, knowing they had witnessed something monumental. The Battle of Midway had lasted barely 24 hours. But in that single day, the Pacific balance of power shifted forever. The Dauntless, once dismissed as outdated, had proven unstoppable. It was not the fastest or the most advanced plane, but it was tough, reliable, and flown by men who refused to give up. Together, they'd rewritten the fate of nations. As the night fell over the Pacific, McCluskey and his crew finally allowed themselves to breathe. Exhausted, they looked out across the dark water where flames still flickered. The war was far from over, but hope, real, tangible hope, now burned brighter than ever. When the smoke cleared over the Pacific, the magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Imperial Navy had suffered a catastrophic defeat. 4 of its frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay at the bottom of the ocean, along with 248 aircraft and over 3,000 of Japan's finest sailors and airmen. In a single day, the Empire's seemingly unstoppable advance had been halted. For America, the news was electrifying. Just 6 months earlier, the nation had been reeling from humiliation and grief. Now, headlines screamed victory at Midway across every front page. The tide of war had turned, and with it, the morale of an entire nation. But for the men who fought there, the triumph carried the weight of sacrifice. Survivors of the dauntless squadrons returned home with hollow eyes, their memories scarred by what they'd seen. Burning ships, silent radios, pilots who never answered. Many were barely in their 20s, yet they had witnessed the collapse of an empire's ambition. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose decision to follow that lone destroyer had changed history, received the Navy Cross for his heroism. When asked about his actions years later, he said quietly, "It wasn't luck, it was duty." His modest words became the essence of Midway, not glory, but grit. The Battle of Midway did more than shift a war. It shattered a myth. Japan's aura of invincibility vanished overnight. Its naval power, built over decades, could never recover the loss of those carriers or the irreplaceable pilots who went down with them. From that point on, Japan would fight defensively, retreating island by island as Allied forces advanced across the Pacific. For the United States, Midway marked the beginning of a new identity, one forged in fire and courage. The victory proved that technology and strategy were only part of the equation. What truly mattered were the people behind the machines. Farmers, factory workers, mechanics, and engineers all had a hand in that turning point. Every rivet on a Dauntless was a testament to American industry and resilience. Back home, the aircraft that once seemed outdated became a symbol of hope. The Douglas SBD Dauntless earned a new nickname, the plane that won Midway. Its rugged design, precise handling, and ability to dive almost vertically made it deadly accurate in the right hands. More than 5,000 would be built before the war's end, but none would match the legend of those that flew on June 4, 1942. Historians still call Midway the most decisive naval battle in modern history. Not because of its scale, there were larger battles to come, but because of its timing. It came when the world needed proof that darkness could be beaten, that courage could turn chaos into victory. Admiral Nimitz, reflecting on the outcome, said, "They had no right to win, yet they did. And in doing so, they changed the course of the war." Even decades later, The ocean floor around Midway holds the silent remains of that day. Twisted metal, shattered propellers, fragments of a struggle that shaped the modern world. When underwater cameras first captured images of the wrecked carriers in the 21st century, historians described them not as relics, but as time capsules of courage. Midway's legacy extended far beyond military strategy. It proved the power of intelligence, the importance of listening, decoding, and anticipating an enemy's move. It proved that leadership mattered, that calm, deliberate decisions like Nimitz's could outweigh raw firepower. And it proved that, in the face of impossible odds, unity could prevail. By 1945, the Pacific War would end where it began, with Japan's defeat. But historians trace the turning point not to Hiroshima, not to Iwo Jima, but to the morning of June 4th, when a handful of dauntless pilots dove through flak and fire to change history. Today, the Battle of Midway stands as more than just a military victory. It's a story of intelligence, instinct, and immense bravery. A reminder that even when hope seems lost, a few courageous decisions can alter the fate of the world. And as the sun sets over the calm waters of the Pacific, it's said that sometimes, if you listen closely, the ocean still whispers the echo of those roaring engines, and the names of the men who never came home. The Battle of Midway wasn't won by chance. It was won by clarity of purpose. By men who refused to surrender when logic said they should. By engineers whose rejected design became the weapon of salvation. And by commanders who saw beyond the fog of war into the fragile balance of fate. The Douglas SBD Dauntless, slow, battered, and often underestimated, became a symbol of the American spirit. It wasn't the fastest, the flashiest, or the most advanced, but it was reliable, lethal, and in the hands of brave men, unstoppable. Every bolt and rivet carried a story. A worker in a California factory tightening a panel. A pilot learning to steady his aim during a 1,000-foot dive. A crew chief wiping oil from the fuselage before launch. Together, they built something that would outlast them all. A legacy carved not in steel, but in sacrifice. Midway proved that wars are not decided by numbers alone. They are decided by choices, by the courage to act when every instinct screams retreat. The battle's lesson reached far beyond the Pacific. It taught nations that innovation isn't always about creating something new. Sometimes it's about believing in what already exists, and in the people who make it work. When the war finally ended in 1945, many dauntless aircraft were retired, scrapped, or forgotten. Yet those who flew them never forgot. They remembered the sound of the dive alarm, the way the horizon tilted before a drop, the blur of the ocean rising fast, and the calm that came when the bomb released, knowing they'd done their part. Today, when historians speak of Midway, they speak of more than strategy. They speak of redemption, of how a rejected weapon, flown by ordinary men, became the turning point of a world at war. And somewhere, beyond the horizon, where the waves stretch into memory, the echo of those engines still lingers. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, courage can dive through fire and emerge victorious.